Welcome to Booked, the bookstore education podcast brought to you by the American Booksellers Association. This episode is part of our Indies Introduced series, where we spotlight debut authors handpicked by booksellers from around the country. In each episode, a bookseller from the Indies Introduced panel will interview the author of a debut title featured in our program.
Hi, I'm Kim Brock from Joseph-Beth Booksellers in Cincinnati, Ohio, and I have the pleasure of talking with Vijay Khurana today. How are you, Vijay?
Hey, I'm doing well. Thanks, Kim. Thanks for having me.
Of course. His debut book, Passenger Seat, is coming out in March, and I am so excited. I loved this book. Loved it. So let me tell you a little bit about Vijay. So Vijay Khurana is a writer and translator based between Berlin and London. His work has appeared in Noon, The Guardian, The Erotic Review, and The White Review Writing in Translation Anthology. He has an MFA from the University of East Anglia and is currently completing a PhD in creative and critical writing at Queen Mary, University of London. Impressive. The Passenger Seat, his first novel, was shortlisted for the 2022 Novel Prize and is on sale in the US on March 3rd. Welcome again, Vijay.
Thank you. Thanks, Kim.
Yes. So, like I said, I love this book. So I just want to know more about you. So what started you on the path to becoming a writer?
I'm not one of those people who says I knew from age 4 that I wanted to be a writer, and I'm not one of those people who was writing a novel in their teens or anything like that. I guess one big thing that happened to me is my school offered German, and from a kind of early age in high school, I just started learning German, and I liked it, and I was kind of relatively good at it, and I just kept doing it, and that ended up meaning that by the time I got to university, I was reading a lot of German writers like Kafka and Heinrich von Kleist, and people who I found just to be doing kind of amazing, very kind of unconventional things with stories, as opposed to the stuff that you might be reading in high school and stuff like that. So I think that was a big thing for me. But then I kind of became a radio presenter for a while, and then but I was always writing stories. I was always sort of trying to write. I remember I had a story published in the university magazine, and so yeah, and through many twists and turns, I sort of did more and more writing as life went on, and yeah, now The Passenger Seat's my first novel.
Exciting. That's exciting. So when you're, get a straight idea, where do you draw your inspiration from?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, books is the obvious answer, right? I guess, like probably for most writers and most readers as well. Yeah, books is the obvious answer. I think that, if I'm writing something, even just to read a few lines of something or some poetry might give me a little idea or a little spark. I feel like I'm quite an oral writer, maybe. I sort of like to hear a voice or hear a sentence. I read aloud a lot when I'm writing. So yeah, stuff that kind of sounds compelling, or a voice that kind of sounds like it needs to be heard, that's kind of demanding to be heard. I really like reading that, and I guess I try to write that as well. And then there are other lovely things that just sort of it's kind of interesting. Like what's really the difference between inspiration and just giving yourself a bit of pleasure in life? Like I like to take the train outside the city and go walking in the woods and things like that. I don't know if that's quite inspiration, but I think it helps,
I think
everything
that counts.
Yeah.
Whatever sort of, gives you that spark. I think that counts.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I know that I was reading a lot as I first started writing The Passenger Seat. I remember reading a book called The Comfort of Strangers by Ian McEwan. It's a British novel, quite a short novel. The Driver's Seat by Muriel Spark, which is kind of has a little echo in the title, obviously, of The Passenger Seat. Yeah, a bunch of other stuff. So I guess it all kind of comes together in my head and swirls around, and then something comes out.
Okay. Well, along those lines, because it was so unique and just different than anything I'd read before, where did the entire premise of the passenger seat come
Yeah, I had been writing a lot of short stories, and I've been really interested in this idea of male friendship. And I'd noticed that I was writing a lot of short stories about male friendship, and also kind of about how like the sexuality of young men can affect their friendship, even if we're talking about heterosexual men. There's still like, that masculinity and that sexuality is still like really influencing the way they relate to each other and the way they relate to the world. And then some of those stories kind of had like an aspect of violence to them, and I realized I was kind of getting interested in this idea of why do men commit violence so often in society, and maybe to take that question further, like what does the friendship itself have anything to do with that,
from?
and if so, what? So yeah, and I mean, obviously, men, we see this all the time in the news, and there were some real events that happened in North America that I also drew from a little bit in the first part of the book, as well as just this kind of, yeah, this question I had, like young men, especially young men, keep doing this sort of thing all the time, by which I mean basically sort of dehumanizing the people around them, whether it be explicitly violent or not. So I was kind of interested in that question, and how it relates to like the performance of masculinity, and how it relates to sort of the way friends will sort of play games with each other, and that games can lead into sort of competition, and that, a friendship is also like it's a collaboration, but it's also maybe, your friend can also be an opponent in some ways.
Hmm.
So yeah, and then the big thing was sort of realizing that the road trip, which is a big part of this novel, was a really perfect sort of storytelling device, I guess, to use to explore some of these things. Um, as soon as I started thinking about road trips, I mean, I went on some when I was sort of around the same age as Teddy and Alvin, the characters in the book.
Hmm.
And I have kind of strong memories of them. Obviously, nothing happened like what happens in the novel, but still, there were these little aspects of like, me and my other male friends just sort of kind of getting along together, working out how to move through the world together, trying to work out who we were based on how we related to each other and things like this. Um, yeah. So, but these like juxtapositions or paradoxes of the road trip, I found super fascinating. Like how the road trip is kind of the whole wide world stretched out in front of you, but at the same time, it's actually really kind of claustrophobic. You're in this like you're in like a small space in a
Right.
vehicle next to somebody else, and maybe it's a bit smelly, or maybe you're tired or whatever.
Oh yeah.
So yeah,
Oh yeah.
so stuff like that. Yeah.
Your road trips are like they're kind of like a test of your relationship in a way too. Like they always say, like, if you want to see, the strength of your relationship, go on a trip together, and especially a road trip, because you're
Yeah.
locked in together. There's nowhere to go, and you're just on your way. So yeah.
Yeah, and I think maybe what happens in the passenger seat is essentially that relationship kind of fails, or maybe not fails, but is shown to be really wanting, is shown to be kind of really flawed.
Yeah.
And I think that's what I was trying to get at. There's a moment in the book where a lady who runs a gas station kind of in the middle of nowhere says that her husband says that people should go on road trips together so that they can have an argument,
Yeah.
so that to let out that kind of tension.
Hmm.
And so that's definitely a kind of, I'm playing with that idea as well. Yeah. Of like it being a test.
Yeah. And you felt that tension the whole time you're reading. Like I'm gripping the book, like, oh, something is going down. Oh man. Like you just feel it the whole time. You did an excellent job with that. That was great.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yes,
That's nice of
yes.
you to say.
So,
Yeah.
with masculinity being like the central theme of this book, and you were saying how you looked at different things around the world, what sort of like how did you go about exploring this theme? with writing a book? Like, did you do research? Did you look at masculinity, in different cultures? Like, how did you prepare for that?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I certainly read a lot. Um, I think that one of the things I was drawing on, as I said before, was kind of my own upbringing, and my own kind of experiences of being a young man, and the times in which, I felt like some of the dynamics that are in the book were kind of happening to, people I knew, or to groups that I was involved in, or things like this. Um, and then, yeah, um, I read a few things that helped me, as well as fiction. There's a book called Between Men by Eve Kosofsky Sedgwick, which I kind of found helpful in terms of like just the way that male friendships are kind of really governed by these structures of power, and they're often really, they have a lot to do with like women, and how the men in this male friendship are actually relating to like women outside that dynamic,
Mm.
and things like that. So I found that really interesting. Um, and yeah, what else? I mean, there was like um, there's a really old essay by Emile Zola called The Experimental Novel, where he sort of talks about putting characters, almost like putting characters into a laboratory to sort of see what they would do. Um,
Mhm.
uh, yeah, which I found kind of interesting. Um, but yeah, essentially, like I guess what one of the other things I'm trying to do is sort of just think about the differences between the two friendships in the book,
Mm.
and to think about like the differences between men who we as sort of as society kind of deem as maybe like monstrous or beyond our understanding because they've done something so terrible,
Mhm.
but then comparing that with sort of, the other friendship in the novel, which is, I would say, between two men who essentially, even though they're flawed, we might sort of think of as essentially good men.
Mm.
But my question is, like, is comparing those two maybe in some way helpful to answering this question of like, why do men so often commit violence as, as groups, or within, within relationships and friendships, sort of thing. So yeah, that was another question. So I guess maybe what I'm saying is I sort of came up with a few questions that I found really interesting along the way, and I also didn't tell myself that I had to sort of solidly answer them, because I don't think that would make a good novel.
Right.
Um, so I just sort of had these kind of guiding questions that I was interested in as I went along.
Yeah, I felt like as I read it, I kept having more questions. Like I started to say, well, what is masculinity, and what are we teaching young men what masculinity should be? Because I mean, not giving anything away, but I feel like Teddy and Alvin had moments where they wanted to be vulnerable with each other, but then they would pull back, almost like, but that's not what men are supposed to do, like that sort of
Right.
thing. And then in the other relationship, you kind of see they had points of vulnerability with each other, but it still was kind of like, but am I allowed to be that way with another? He's my friend. Can I be that way with him? And with women, I mean, we're just vulnerable to each other all the time. Like from day one, it's
Right.
kind of like that. And I don't think men are allowed that. And it would be even, healthy if they were allowed to, if men were allowed to be that way.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And that kind of intimacy that is being vulnerable is, I think, lacking, in a lot of these kinds of friendships or relationships that we're talking about, for sure. Um, yeah.
Yeah. And I thought about the violence too. Like, why is it in so much in men and not in women? Because like when women commit acts of violence, is surprised, like, oh, you don't
Mm,
usually see women
yeah.
who do this sort of thing. But with men, it's almost like, oh yeah, he did it. All right. And why is that acceptable? Like, yeah, you gave me a lot to think
Yeah.
about. Like the whole time I'm reading this, I was like, I'm thinking about all these things. So yeah.
Yeah, I'm really glad about that. Yeah, that's definitely another one of those kind of guiding questions was just like why does this just keep happening over and over again? And we
Yeah,
don't seem to have even like a way to explain it, let alone sort of talk about changing it.
yeah. And why? Yeah, and why is yeah? Why are we not trying to change it? Like I don't think people are dismissing it, but they're just kind of like, let's accept it. It's just what it is. But why? Like, why are we just accepting it? Yeah.
Yeah. And as I say, I'm not trying to sort of answer any of those questions. I
Right.
don't think the book is sort of gives any neat answers, but maybe, yeah, maybe just the fact that there aren't neat answers is what makes it so hard.
Yeah. Yeah, like I feel like this would be like a fantastic book club book, like because it'll make people talk. Like it will generate probably some of the best conversations they're ever going to have in their life because it's so much to think about. So yeah, so that's fantastic. Yeah.
Yeah, I hope so. I hope so. That would make me really happy if it kind of starts, starts conversations between people for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. So your book is coming out March 3rd in the US and Canada. Exciting.
Yeah.
So how will you celebrate your book being published? Because you have to celebrate.
Well, if I have to, then I will. I don't know.
You have to celebrate.
No, I will. I'm partway writing. I'm part of my way through writing something else at the moment, and I also work as a
Ooh.
translator, so I feel very busy. But
Oh.
having said that, I I am going to celebrate. I have a couple of like readings, unfortunately not in the US or Canada, but I have something in London and something in Berlin, so I'll be doing those. But I think on March 4, yeah, like for my birthday last year, like around a year ago, someone gave me a really nice bottle of wine, and it's kind of been sitting in the kitchen in our apartment, like above where the microwave is, like this whole time. So I think
Right.
March 3, sorry. Yeah, March 3, I think my wife and I, or maybe we'll just open that bottle of wine. That'll be
There you
nice.
go.
Yeah.
Celebrate. Well, Vijay, thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank
Everyone,
you.
Passenger Seat, March 3rd. Go get a copy, read it, talk about it, because you're going to want to talk about it. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you for listening to Booked, the bookstore education podcast brought to you by the American Booksellers Association. Don't forget to subscribe to the show on your favorite podcast app. Additional educational resources can always be found on the ABA website at www.bookweb.org. Happy reading!